There's a specific kind of pain that doesn't have a name. It's not the pain of being hurt. It's the pain of being invisible. And the strange thing is, you might not even know you're still carrying it. You grew up. You moved on. You built a life. And from the outside, it probably looks fine. Maybe it even looks good. But somewhere underneath all of that, there's a child who learned something about themselves that they were never supposed to learn. They learned that their presence wasn't enough to make someone stay, that their emotions were too loud, too much, too inconvenient, that silence was safer than being seen, that shrinking was a form of protection. And here's what no one tells you about that. It doesn't just become a memory, it becomes a belief. Not a thought you can argue with, not something you can logic your way out of on a Tuesday afternoon. A feeling that runs quietly in the background of almost every relationship you've ever had, every room you've ever walked into, every moment where someone asked you how you were doing, and you said fine without thinking. Carl Rogers spent his entire life trying to understand what happens to a human being when they're not truly seen, and what he found wasn't complicated. It was devastating in its simplicity. We don't just need love, we need to be witnessed. We need someone to look at us, not at who we could be, not at what we did wrong, not at the version of us that would be easier to deal with, but at who we actually are, right now, in this moment. And when that doesn't happen in childhood, something shifts, something fundamental. Think about the first time you tried to express something real. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was sadness, maybe it was just excitement about something you loved. Something that lit you up in a way that felt almost too big to contain, and the room stayed quiet, or someone changed the subject, or you were told, in one way or another, to pull yourself together, to calm down, that it wasn't that serious. What did you do with that emotion? Where did it go? Because it didn't disappear. Emotions don't disappear. They just learn to travel differently. They find other routes. They start living below the surface, showing up later, in moments that seem unrelated, in reactions that feel bigger than the situation, in a kind of numbness that you can't quite explain. Rogers called this the beginning of a split, the moment when a child starts to separate who they are from who they need to appear to be. And it happens so gradually that you don't notice until years later, when you're standing in a room full of people who care about you, people who have shown up for you, and you still feel profoundly alone. Not lonely. Alone. There's a difference. Loneliness is about absence. This is about presence, being present and still feeling unreachable, even to yourself. That feeling isn't random. It has roots. If you've ever felt like no matter how much you achieve, something still feels hollow. If you've ever hit a goal you worked toward for years and felt nothing on the other side of it, this might be why. The child who was ignored didn't just experience loneliness. They internalized a conclusion. A quiet, wordless verdict about their own worth, not written anywhere, not spoken out loud, but absorbed, the way children absorb everything, completely, and without defense, not in dramatic language, not in a moment of crisis, but slowly, across hundreds of ordinary moments where no one asked how they felt, where no one leaned in, where no one stayed curious, where you finished talking and the conversation moved on before you were done. Rogers talked about what he called conditions of worth, the unspoken rules we absorb about when we deserve to be loved. Be useful. Be easy. Don't need too much. Don't feel too much. Be the version of yourself that causes the least disruption. And when you manage to do all of that, maybe you'll be okay. And maybe, as you're listening to this, something inside you recognizes that pattern. Maybe part of you is seeing yourself in these words for the first time. If this resonates with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next conversations about emotional healing and self-understanding, and leave a comment below sharing what this experience was like for you. Your story might be the very thing someone else needs to feel seen. And the terrifying part is that most of us built our entire adult personality around those rules, without ever consciously choosing them, without ever sitting down and deciding, yes, this is how I want to move through the world. It just happened, slowly, and then it was simply who we were, or so we believed. If this is resonating with something quiet inside you, If some part of you is recognizing something you've never quite been able to say out loud, something that feels both unfamiliar and completely obvious at the same time, you're not alone in this. You've never been alone in this. There's a whole life lived between those lines, and a lot of people live it without ever questioning whether the story they're telling about themselves is actually true, without ever asking whether the voice that says you're too much or you're not enough actually belongs to them, or whether it was borrowed from someone who was never qualified to speak on the matter. Here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. The version of you that learned to be invisible. They weren't broken. They were adaptive. They were incredibly intelligent in a very specific way. They learned to read the room. They learned to disappear at the right time. They learned to sense the shift in someone's energy before the shift became a word, before the word became a wound. They learned to be low maintenance enough to keep the peace, agreeable enough to avoid the conflict, quiet enough to stay safe. That wasn't weakness. That was survival. But survival strategies outlive the danger. And long after the house is safe, long after you've left that environment, long after the people who made you feel invisible are no longer part of your daily life, those strategies keep running. They keep running because they were never told they could stop. Because no one came back and said, you don't have to do that anymore. You're allowed to exist without earning it. And so they show up as withdrawing when someone gets too close, as apologizing before you've even done anything wrong, as the feeling that your needs are somehow too heavy for other people to hold, as a strange, inexplicable guilt for wanting things, for taking up space, for asking. This is what Rogers meant when he talked about the gap between the self and the ideal self, the distance between who you actually are, your full, unedited, sometimes contradictory, very human self, and who you believe you need to be in order to be loved. That gap is where anxiety lives. That gap is where chronic people-pleasing lives. That gap is where the exhaustion of performing yourself, instead of simply being yourself, slowly wears you down in ways you don't always notice until you're already running on empty. And the more you perform, the further you drift, because every time you hide a real feeling to protect someone else's comfort, every time you agree when you don't agree, every time you smile through something that hurt you, you send yourself a quiet message. You tell yourself, the real version of me isn't welcome here. And here's where it gets interesting, because most people try to close that gap by changing themselves, by becoming better, more successful, more likable, more emotionally controlled, more polished, as if one day they'll finally cross some invisible threshold and earn the visibility they were denied, as if achievement is the answer to a wound that was never about competence. But Rogers saw something different. He sat across from thousands of people who had tried exactly that, who had optimized and improved, and succeeded and still felt the gap widening. And he noticed something. The wound didn't heal through achievement. It didn't heal through insight alone either. It didn't even heal through understanding why it happened. He called it unconditional positive regard. The experience of being accepted without conditions, not celebrated for what you do, not tolerated in spite of what you feel. Just accepted fully, as you are right now, including the parts that are still figuring it out. And the radical thing about that is, it doesn't require a perfect childhood to access now. It doesn't require someone else to finally get it right. It doesn't require a relationship that gives you everything you never had. It can begin with how you relate to yourself. If this channel has ever felt like a space where you're allowed to think deeply, without being judged, where you can sit with the uncomfortable parts of yourself, without having to immediately fix them, I'd invite you to stay. Subscribe if you haven't, not because the algorithm needs it, but because some conversations deserve to continue, and because you deserve a place where the depth of your inner life is treated as something worth exploring. Because we're just getting to the part that changes things. Here's what Rogers observed in thousands of hours of conversation with real people, in a small room, with nowhere to hide. The moment healing begins is almost never dramatic. It doesn't arrive as a breakthrough or a revelation or a single conversation that rewrites everything. It arrives as a small, quiet moment where someone feels genuinely understood, where they say something true and the other person doesn't flinch, doesn't redirect, doesn't offer a solution, just stays. That's it. Not fixed, not advised, not analyzed, just understood. And what that does to a person, someone who spent years learning to shrink, learning to translate their inner world into something more palatable before sharing it, is extraordinary. Because for the first time, they don't have to earn the right to be in the room. They're already there, and that's already enough. Most people who were ignored as children become one of two things in adulthood. Either they fade into the background, agreeable, accommodating, careful not to take up too much space, somehow both present and absent at the same time, or they become almost hyper-visible, loud, intense, always pushing for a reaction, because a reaction, even a negative one, is still proof that they exist, still proof that they register. Both of these are the same wound, just expressed differently. One learned to disappear before being dismissed. The other learned to make themselves impossible to ignore. Different strategies. Same question underneath. Am I here? Can you see me? Do I matter? And neither of them is the person underneath. Beneath the fading, beneath the noise, there is someone who simply wanted to be known. Not admired, not agreed with, not praised or pitied or managed. Just known, in the full, ordinary, unremarkable way that every human being deserves to be known. That's not a lot to ask, and yet for many of us, it was everything. Here's the question that Rogers would sit with, and I want you to really feel this, not just think it. Who would you be if you had always been seen? If your emotions had been welcomed instead of tolerated? If the people around you had been curious about your inner life instead of inconvenienced by it? If someone had leaned toward you instead of looking away in the moments when you needed them most? Who would that person be? Not a fantasy, not a better version. Just you, without the armor. You, without the apologies. You, without the habit of making yourself smaller before anyone asks you to. Because I don't think you're as far from that person as you believe. The visibility you were denied doesn't disappear just because no one offered it. It goes somewhere. It becomes a longing that shows up in relationships, in creative work, in the books you underline too heavily, in the way you write things down that no one will ever read, in the way you sometimes wish someone would just ask, really ask, and actually wait for the answer. It also shows up in the moments you feel unexpectedly emotional over something small, in the quiet sting when you realize someone misunderstood you and didn't try to correct it, in the fatigue that follows a day of being on, of calibrating yourself to fit the temperature of every room. These are not signs of fragility. They are signals. They are reminders that there is still something inside you that wants congruence, that wants the outside of your life to match the inside of it. That longing is not pathology. That longing is not neediness. That longing is the healthiest thing about you. It's the part that refused to stop wanting what it always deserved. And there's something important in that. Something Rogers understood deeply. That the impulse toward connection, toward being known, toward visibility, is not a weakness to be overcome. It's the organism trying to return to something it never should have lost. Which means it hasn't left. It's been waiting. And maybe that's exactly what this is. A place that asks. A place that waits. If any part of this has touched something real in you, if you found yourself thinking of a specific moment, a specific room, a specific version of yourself that learned too early to go quiet, I'd genuinely like to know what it stirred. Leave a comment, not to perform reflection, but to practice it. Tell me what the child in you needed to hear, or what you're only now beginning to understand. Tell me what word landed hardest, or which sentence felt like something you'd been waiting for someone to say. Like this video if it reached something honest in you, and subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into this kind of conversation, because this isn't the end of the thread. Rogers believed something that I think is worth carrying with you today, and worth returning to on the days when the old feeling comes back. He believed that the human organism, left in the right conditions, naturally moves toward wholeness, not because it's forced to, not because it finally figured out the correct steps, but because growth is what we do when we're finally allowed to, when the conditions become safe enough, when we stop spending all our energy on defense and finally have something left over for becoming. And those conditions are not abstract. They are built slowly, in real time, in conversations where you risk saying what you actually mean, in boundaries that feel uncomfortable but honest, in moments when you resist the urge to pre-edit your emotions into something easier to digest. Every time you choose alignment over approval, something subtle reorganizes inside you. The split narrows, the distance softens. You don't have to become someone new. You don't have to dismantle everything you've built or excavate every difficult memory or trace every pattern back to its precise origin. You just have to begin questioning whether the rules you've been living by actually belong to you, or whether they belong to a room you left a long time ago, to a version of events that made sense then and no longer has to define now. And questioning those rules can feel destabilizing at first, because if you were praised for being easy, you may not know who you are when you're inconvenient. If you were valued for being strong, you may not know how to be when you're tired. If you were rewarded for being self-sufficient, you may not know how to let someone help you without feeling exposed. But unfamiliar does not mean wrong. It often means you are finally stepping outside the script. The child who learned to be invisible did what they had to do. They were smart. They were resourceful. They found a way to stay safe inside a situation that offered them very little margin for error. And they deserve to be honored for that, not pitied, not analyzed to death, but genuinely honored for the intelligence it took to survive something that shouldn't have been theirs to survive. But you are not in that room anymore. And maybe the most important thing you can do, the most quietly revolutionary act available to you, is to start letting yourself be seen. Not perfectly, not all at once, not in some grand gesture of vulnerability that costs you more than you have to give right now, just a little more honestly than yesterday, in one conversation, with one person, or even just within yourself, in the quiet before sleep, when no one is watching and the performance can finally rest. That's where it begins. Not in insight, not in understanding, not even in healing, exactly, but in the small, daily courage of letting yourself take up space. And somewhere in that ordinary, unremarkable, deeply human decision to stop disappearing, something in you starts to return, quietly, without announcement, something that was never really gone, something that has been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for exactly this.